October 5th, 2018, 7:42 a.m., Woodlawn Cemetery, Bronx, New York. The gates were still locked when Mamie Johnson stepped out of the black sedan. She was 84 years old, arthritis in both hands, a heart that had already survived one stroke, and a secret she had carried for half a century pressing against her chest, like a second rib cage. Inside the iron gates, under a gray sky, lay the grave of her husband, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, dead since 1968, buried with police escorts, buried with honors. Buried, everyone believed, exactly as he was meant to be. Except Mamie was no longer sure. And that doubt, small at first, then unbearable, was why she had signed the paperwork now folded in her coat pocket. Court approved, quiet, no press, no family, just a funeral director, 2 cemetery officials, and a locked coffin about to be opened for the first time in 50 years. This wasn't nostalgia, it was fear. Because 3 weeks earlier, a man she didn't recognize had knocked on her apartment door in Harlem, middle-aged, well-dressed, calm in the way dangerous people often are. He didn't ask how she was doing. He said, "Mrs. Johnson, you buried the wrong man." She laughed at him, tried to close the door. He stopped it with one finger and added something that drained the blood from her face. "He died screaming," the man said, "and whoever is in that coffin isn't him." Now the cemetery gates creaked open. The workers moved with professional distance, but their eyes kept drifting to Mamie. Everyone knew the name. Everyone knew the legend. No one understood why his widow was standing here half a century later, demanding an exhumation before sunrise. The coffin came up slow, wood darkened by time, metal handles dulled, no cracks, no signs of disturbance, which should have comforted her. It didn't, because Mamie remembered something no one else did. The night Bumpy died, she never saw his body, not at the hospital, not at the funeral home, not even at the burial. They told her his face was too damaged. Heart attack at Wells Restaurant, collapsed mid-meal. That was the story, a clean ending, convenient, final. She had been handed a closed casket and a lifetime of silence. The funeral director unlocked the coffin. The hinges groaned as the lid was raised inch by inch. The smell hit first. Old wood, stale air, something sour that didn't belong. Mamie stepped closer. She didn't scream, she didn't cry, she didn't even breathe. Because the man inside was wearing Bumpy's suit. But the face was wrong. The jawline too narrow, the nose unbroken, the hands, she stared at the hands, too smooth. Bumpy's hands had been ruined by prison fights and street violence. Knuckles bent, fingers scarred. These were clean, untouched. The funeral director whispered, "Ma'am?" Mamie's knees buckled. She collapsed onto the wet grass, her vision tunneling, her chest seizing as one impossible thought drowned out everything else. If this wasn't her husband, then who had she buried? And where had Bumpy Johnson really gone? Because someone, somewhere, had gone to extraordinary lengths to make sure this coffin stayed closed. And whatever the truth was, it was still dangerous enough, 50 years later, to make a grown man knock on an old woman's door and warn her to leave the dead alone. So why now? And who was going to stop her if she didn't? What secret was buried deeper than the grave itself? The man's name was Calvin Porter. He didn't tell Mamie that the first time they met. He only gave it up later, after the coffin came up wrong, and the past stopped behaving. Calvin was 56, a maintenance supervisor at a Bronx public hospital, divorced. 2 grown sons who barely spoke to him, One daughter, Renee, 32, who needed a kidney transplant and didn't have time to wait. That was the problem eating him alive. Renee's insurance had capped out. Dialysis 3 times a week. Every delay meant damage that couldn't be undone. Calvin had already sold his truck, borrowed against a pension he hadn't earned yet. The transplant list moved slow, and the clock moved fast. Which was how a man like Calvin ended up sitting across from a stranger in a diner off Jerome Avenue, being offered cash he couldn't refuse to do something he absolutely shouldn't. The stranger slid an envelope across the table. Inside, $15,000. Not a donation, not a loan, a down payment. All you have to do, the man said, is remind Mrs. Johnson that some graves are better left closed. Calvin asked the obvious question. What happens if I don't? The man smiled. Not threatening. Just tired. Then we find someone who will. Calvin knew what that meant. He also knew Mamie Johnson's name long before he knocked on her door. Everyone from Harlem did, even if they pretended not to. He didn't know details. He didn't need to. The name alone carried weight, enough to make people careful. But the money in that envelope could keep Renee alive long enough for a donor to come through. So Calvin did what he'd been paid to do. He went to Mame's building. He told her just enough to scare her. Not the whole truth. Not the part that would get him killed. Just a warning shaped like concern. Mrs. Johnson, he'd said, standing in her doorway, you don't know who you're poking. Whatever questions you're asking, you stop. She'd looked at him for a long time, long enough that he almost backed out. Then she asked him something he hadn't prepared for. Do you know my husband's hands? She said. Calvin blinked. No, ma'am. They were ruined, she said quietly. By chains, by fights, by breaking people's faces. If you've seen him, you'd know that. Calvin felt his stomach drop, because he had seen the body. Not at the funeral. Years later. In a storage room beneath a closed nursing home in Queens, wrapped in plastic, no paperwork, no name. Just a face everyone pretended not to recognize, and those hands were broken exactly the way Mamie described. Calvin hadn't been hired to lie to her. He'd been hired to stop her. And now, standing at Woodlawn Cemetery watching her collapse in front of an open coffin that clearly held the wrong man, Calvin understood something too late. This wasn't a bluff. Someone had swapped the body, someone with access, authority, and enough fear of the truth to protect the lie for 50 years. The cemetery officials scrambled. An ambulance was called. The funeral director closed the coffin again like that could undo what had already happened. Mamie was lifted onto a stretcher, eyes fluttering open, searching for Calvin as if she'd known all along he'd be there. He met her gaze, and in that moment, Calvin had to choose. Go back to the man who paid him, take the rest of the money, keep his daughter alive a little longer, or tell Mamie Johnson what he knew, and accept whatever came after. Because if she talked, people would die. And if she stayed silent, someone already had. As the ambulance doors shut, Mamie whispered one thing through cracked lips. You came to warn me, she said. Now you're going to tell me why? Calvin didn't answer. Because once he did, there would be no walking away. So which mattered more? His daughter's life, or the truth about a man the city had already buried? And who was listening if he made the wrong choice? The hospital room smelled like disinfectant and old flowers. Mamie Johnson lay propped up on white pillows, an oxygen tube resting beneath her nose. Her eyes were open. sharp despite the machines. She had survived too much in her life to be fooled by concern now. Calvin stood near the window, arms folded, pretending to watch traffic crawl along the Bronx streets below. He hadn't left since the ambulance brought her in. Not because he was brave, because he was trapped. The man from the diner had called him twice already. No voicemail. Just missed calls that sat on his phone like loaded weapons. Mamie broke the silence first. "You saw him?" she said. Calvin didn't turn around. "You wouldn't be here if you hadn't." He swallowed. "I don't know what you think I saw." She smiled faintly. "I've been lied to by professionals. You're not one of them." That landed. Calvin finally faced her. "Mrs. Johnson, there are people who don't want you asking these questions. I'm trying to keep you safe." "You came to scare me," she said. "That's not the same thing." She shifted, wincing as pain crossed her face. For a moment she looked her age, then it passed. "Tell me who paid you," she said, "and I'll decide whether I should be afraid." Calvin's phone buzzed again. Unknown number. He silenced it. "My daughter's sick," he said. The words came out before he could stop them. "Very sick. They offered me money." Mamie nodded slowly, no judgment, just recognition. "Money always comes with instructions," she said. "What were yours?" "To make sure you didn't open the coffin." Silence settled between them, thick and heavy. Mamie closed her eyes. When she opened them again, they were wet, but steady. "I knew," she said. "The night they buried him, I knew." Calvin frowned. "Then why wait 50 years? "Because fear ages slower than grief," she said, "and because someone finally made a mistake." She reached for the bedside table and picked up a folded document. Old. Yellowed. Hospital letterhead from 1968. "I found this in a box that wasn't mine," she said. "A discharge transfer. My husband was moved out of Harlem Hospital 2 hours before he was pronounced dead." Calvin felt the room tilt. "Moved where?" "That's the problem," she said. "The destination line is missing." A knock at the door interrupted them. 2 men in suits stepped in without waiting to be invited. Hospital security badges clipped too neatly to their jackets. Faces blank. One of them spoke to Calvin. "We need a word." Mamie watched them carefully. "About what?" The man didn't look at her. "Hospital procedure." Calvin stood. His heart pounded so loud he was sure they could hear it. In the hallway, the man leaned in close. "This has gone far enough," he said quietly. "You were told to discourage her, not participate." "I didn't open the coffin," Calvin said. "No," the man replied. "But you didn't stop it either." The second man glanced down the corridor. "You have a daughter," he said. "Renee. Dialysis Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays." Calvin's mouth went dry. "She needs stability," the first man continued, "not complications. This situation creates complications." "What do you want?" Calvin asked. "For Mrs. Johnson to rest," the man said, "and for you to remember who's paying attention." They walked away. Calvin stood frozen, then went back into the room. Mamie didn't ask what was said. She already knew. "They're afraid," she said, "which means we're close." "Close to what?" Calvin snapped. "Getting killed?" She met his eyes. "Close to finding out who decided my husband couldn't be allowed to die." Calvin laughed bitterly. "You think they kept him alive?" "I think they kept him useful," she said. "And when he stopped being useful, they made him disappear." Calvin's phone vibrated again. A text this time. "Last warning. Walk away." He looked at Mamie, At the documents, at the door, every path forward was worse than the last. And somewhere beneath all of it, a question pressed harder than fear. If Bumpy Johnson didn't die in that restaurant, who had decided his life was worth more alive than dead? And what happened when that value expired? The storage facility was scheduled for demolition. That was the mistake. Mamie found the notice folded inside the same anonymous envelope that had delivered the hospital transfer slip. No return address, no note. Just an Orange City sticker peeled from a condemned building in Queens, and one line circled in red ink. Sublevel. Medical storage. Calvin stared at it, like it might explode. "You don't even know what you're looking for," he said. "Yes, I do," Mamie replied. "I'm looking for the place they hid him when he stopped belonging to the streets and started belonging to someone else." It took 3 days to get there. Not openly, not legally. Calvin called in a favor from a former co-worker who now worked city maintenance, a night shift, backdoor access, 15 minutes, no more. The building sat between two abandoned nursing homes, its windows boarded, its entrance chained. Spray paint and vines hid the original sign. You wouldn't notice it unless you were already looking, which meant someone had counted on that. Inside, the air was stale and cold. Fluorescent lights flickered as they descended a concrete stairwell that seemed to drop too far for a building that size. Calvin's phone had no signal. "Of course it doesn't," he muttered. They reached the sublevel. Metal shelves, rusted gurneys, file cabinets with their drawers ripped out. This wasn't storage. It was erasure. Mamie stopped walking. "There," she said. A plastic-wrapped shape lay against the far wall, human-sized. Calvin felt his knees weaken. They approached slowly. The plastic was brittle, yellowed with age. When Calvin peeled it back, the smell confirmed what his eyes already knew. This wasn't a stand-in. This wasn't a decoy. This was Ellsworth Johnson. Older than he should have been, thinner, hair gone gray at the temples, but unmistakable, and alive longer than anyone had ever admitted. Mamie knelt despite Calvin's protest. Her fingers traced his face, stopping at the mouth, stitched, not by a mortician, by someone in a hurry. Calvin backed away, breath ragged. "They didn't kill him in that restaurant," he said. "They took him." "Yes," Mamie replied, "because a dead man can't testify." Calvin frowned. "Testify to what?" Before she could answer, the lights snapped off. Footsteps echoed from the stairwell, too many. A flashlight beam cut through the dark. "Mrs. Johnson," a voice called out, calm, familiar. The man from the diner stepped into the light. "You should have listened." Calvin turned, heart pounding. "You said he was dead." "I said he died screaming," the man replied. "I didn't say when." 2 more men appeared behind him. One held a gun. The other carried a file folder, thick and sealed. "You were never supposed to find this place," the man continued, "but once you did, there were only 2 options left." Mamie stood slowly. "You used him," she said. "You kept him hidden because he knew names, routes, deals that went higher than the streets." The man smiled thinly. "He was cooperative at first. Then he wasn't." Calvin's voice shook. "Then why the body swap?" "Because legends don't age well," the man said, "and living men ask questions." The gun came up. Calvin moved without thinking. He lunged, not at the shooter, but at the file folder. Papers scattered, photographs, signatures. A list of protected informants stretching into the late 70s. Names still alive. The gun fired, but not at Calvin. The shooter's hand jerked sideways as Mamie swung the flashlight with everything she had left. Bone met metal. The gun clattered across the floor. Chaos erupted. Calvin grabbed the folder. The man from the diner shouted orders. Someone tackled Calvin. He hit the ground hard, the air driven from his lungs. A second shot rang out, then silence. When the lights flickered back on, one man was bleeding, another unconscious. The third, gone. Sirens wailed in the distance, too fast. Someone had already called it in. Calvin pushed himself up, clutching the folder. Mamie stood over Bumpy's body, trembling. Not from fear, but from resolve. "They didn't just steal my husband," she said. "They stole 50 years of truth." Calvin looked at the documents. "If this gets out," he said, "people will fall." "Yes," she replied, "and some of them deserve it." The sirens grew louder. Calvin made a decision. He handed her the folder. "I'll distract them," he said. "You disappear." "What about your daughter?" she asked. He hesitated, then nodded toward the papers. "This is worth more than money." Mamie squeezed his hand once. "Then don't waste it." Footsteps thundered down the stairs. Calvin stepped forward, and as the first uniform rounded the corner, one terrible truth settled in his chest. They hadn't been hiding a dead man. They had been hiding a living liability. And now that liability had just been found, along with proof that no one was ever meant to see. So the question wasn't whether this story would end badly. It was who would survive long enough to tell it. The official report came out 3 days later. It said the sub-level collapse was caused by structural failure. It said no human remains were recovered. It said any rumors to the contrary were unfounded. Calvin read the report from a plastic chair in the ICU waiting room, his arm in a sling, a stitched gash above his eyebrow still burning. They had taken him in for questioning. They had kept him overnight. They had let him go without charges, which scared him more than an arrest would have. Renee slept down the hall, dialysis tubes humming softly. Her skin looked gray, tired, fragile. At 2:14 a.m., Calvin's phone vibrated. Unknown number. "Check your email." The message had no sender name, no subject line, just scanned documents, bank transfers, witness protection authorizations. Internal memos stamped confidential, and one note at the end. "This is the leverage. Use it once." Calvin stared at the screen. If he went public, he'd be dead before sunrise. If he went quiet, Renee would be dead by winter. He made his choice at dawn, not to the press, not to the police, to a transplant coordinator in Albany who had access to private donor lists and discretionary approvals. By noon, Renee was moved to priority pending. By nightfall, Calvin was warned not to leave the hospital. Meanwhile, across the city, Mamie Johnson packed one suitcase. She didn't take photographs. She didn't take jewelry. She took a burner phone and a single envelope Calvin had given her, copies of the names he hadn't destroyed. She left Harlem without telling anyone, no farewell, no explanation. 2 days later, her apartment was broken into. Nothing was stolen. A message was carved into the kitchen table. "You won't live long enough to finish this." Mamie read it calmly. She had already finished. She mailed the envelope to 3 separate addresses, each to a person who hated the others just enough to act independently. By the end of the week, subpoenas were being drafted. By the end of the month, 2 men quietly resigned. No announcements, no apologies. Calvin watched it all from a distance. Renee got the call on a Tuesday. compatible donor, surgery scheduled. She cried. He didn't, because he knew that the price hadn't finished revealing itself yet, and somewhere in the city, a man who had survived prisons, wars, and erasure had finally been found. But not rescued. Buried twice, once in the ground, once in the truth. So the question wasn't who paid. It was who would be taken next, now that the silence had cracked and everyone involved knew it. Harlem didn't hear the story, not the real one. What Harlem felt was the tremor. It started quietly. Contracts stalled. Favors delayed. Phone calls unanswered. Men who'd always been reachable suddenly weren't. Others showed up nervous, speaking in half sentences, glancing over their shoulders like the past had finally learned how to walk. Old names came up again. Not in public, not out loud. In whispers, in back rooms, in late-night arguments that ended with slammed doors. Because some of the names on those documents were supposed to be untouchable, retired, safe, cleaned up by time. Now they weren't. A former city official canceled a memoir deal without explanation. A retired detective moved his family to Florida and sold his house at a loss. A man who had once bragged about knowing everything there was to know about Harlem stopped taking visitors altogether. Nobody mentioned Bumpy Johnson. They didn't have to. The fear wasn't about what he'd done. It was about what he'd known. Calvin felt the shift before he saw it. Security appeared outside the hospital without being requested. Private, not police. Renee's transplant went ahead on schedule, but the recovery floor was locked down tighter than necessary. "You made powerful enemies," the surgeon told him quietly. "I didn't make them," Calvin replied. "I reminded them." At night he dreamed of file folders spilling open, names bleeding through the paper, faces aging and unaging at the same time. Mamie was already gone by then. No forwarding address. No contact. Just one voicemail left on Calvin's phone the day after Renee's surgery. "I did what I could," Mamie said. "Now it's your turn to live with it." Weeks passed, then months. The investigations didn't explode. They narrowed. Selective pressure, surgical. Careers ended without explanation. Pensions vanished. Quiet indictments sealed behind closed doors. Nothing that made headlines. Everything that made people afraid. Calvin returned to work under a new supervisor who never looked him in the eye. Renee recovered slowly, stronger each day, alive. But Calvin noticed the cost in other places. Friends stopped calling. A neighbor crossed the street to avoid him. Someone spray-painted snitch on his car, then scratched it out as if reconsidering. The city had decided how to categorize him. Useful, but not safe. And far away, in a place no one thought to look, Mamie Johnson watched the news without sound, tracking names, dates, patterns. She didn't smile. She didn't relax. Because she knew something the rest of them didn't yet. This wasn't closure. It was a redistribution. The weight that had been sitting on one man's shoulders for decades had shifted. And now it was spread across people who had spent their lives pretending it didn't exist. So the real question wasn't whether the truth had changed anything. It was who would crack first. Now that the city was holding its breath and waiting for the other shoe to drop. The last thing Mamie Johnson did with her husband's name wasn't public, it wasn't loud, and it wasn't for revenge. 6 months after the exhumation, a sealed affidavit was quietly filed in a federal clerk's office in Washington, D.C. No press release, no signature that could be traced back to her. Just one verified statement entered into the record and immediately locked. Inside it was a single sentence that mattered more than all the names. Ellsworth Johnson had cooperated once. Then he refused. Not because he was threatened, but because the deal required him to identify a woman who had helped move money for men who still held office. Mamie didn't include the woman's name. She didn't need to. The timing alone was enough. Within weeks, a confirmation hearing was postponed indefinitely, then withdrawn. Officially for personal reasons. The woman never knew why. She never had to. Calvin heard about it months later while sitting beside Renee in a park, watching her laugh for the first time without pain in her face. He felt relief and something else. Loss. Because the truth hadn't freed anyone. It had just been spent carefully like currency to buy time for people who needed it most. Bumpy Johnson didn't come back. He didn't get justice. He became leverage one final time. And maybe that was the cruelest part. The man who survived prisons, exile, and erasure wasn't remembered for how he lived, but for what his silence was worth after he was gone. If you want more stories where history hides its sharpest truths in the shadows, subscribe and stay with us. Some graves stay closed, not because they're empty, but because opening them changes who gets to breathe afterward.